Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what? Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool.
I'm a big fan of video learning. I used it to learn editing when I set up this podcast. And recently I came across a great tool that helps you make instructional videos really quickly and easily. It's called Powtoon. If you saw a video trailer on the way to this podcast, did that using Powtoon. It's ridiculously easy to get your head round and has a huge library of assets and templates that save an awful lot of time. It's got 26 million users worldwide and L&D teams love it.
There's a jealousy in the team. Like everybody wants to play with the fun tool, you know?
They just launched their business platform with great collaboration features, the ability to apply your own branding, and a lot of support to ensure your videos make an impact. Even better, they're offering 20% off any Powtoon business plan, plus 1 month free, exclusively for listeners to this podcast. Just visit go.powtoon.com/learninghack to secure your discount now. Well, after you've listened to this podcast, of course. Learning in the flow of work has been a popular buzz phrase for some time, but recent developments in tech have brought it to the fore, and people are wondering now how to do it without pouring a ton of sand in the machine. Will it slow things down, interrupt people, or add to the cognitive load and stresses they're already suffering? My guests this time, Karen E Watkins and Victoria Marsick, have been researching and writing about this area together for upwards of 30 years. We talk about work-based learning, learning-based work, and that elusive object of desire, the learning organization. We had some audio issues with a creaky headset, but if it's a slightly lo-fi conversation, it's a very high-value one. I thought I'd have to be on my mettle with these two. What I didn't expect was that they'd be such good fun. We had a great time recording this chat, and I hope you have an equally great time listening to it. Welcome, Karen and Victoria, to the Learning Hack podcast. Can you each describe your roles and what you work on and your main focus in the field of learning? And I gather this is kind of a long-standing work partnership, so that's interesting in itself. So who wants to kick off first?
You want to start, Karen?
Sure, happy to.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm a professor at the University of Georgia, and I've been writing with Victoria for over 30 years. And in that time, we've been exploring informal and incidental learning in the workplace and how you create a culture of learning, one that actually supports learning in organizations. And so in that time, we've also built a questionnaire called the Dimensions of a Learning Organization Questionnaire, which is used all over the world in multiple languages and many research studies and sometimes for practices as a diagnostic. So I guess that's the main thing. I teach in a program called Learning, Leadership, and Organization Development. A lot of my work is based using action research.
Victoria?
And, I think when Karen and I met, we started finishing one another's sentences because we have enough in common that we share some very strong views about, and probably I'd say groundings around what learning is and how it's accomplished and how it really supports organizational learning and change. But at the same time, we also have some differences in that Karen comes from a stronger background in organizational development, and my background is in adult learning, and adult learning with a focus initially on individuals. I've done a lot of work before I came to the university as a learning and development person. I worked in UNICEF for a number of years, and then I did some consulting with different organizations, and I came to this position in adult learning and leadership. Wasn't called that at the time, but that's what it's called now in the Department of Organization and Leadership. So I kind of started from the individual learning side. I think, Karen, you did too, in the sense that you did a lot of faculty development. So.
I did faculty and organizational development.
Yeah.
So, but it was really both. I mean, there's always been kind of a, an organization development slant.
Right. And And I, because I do work as Karen does in organizations and think about it, whether the organization is a school or whether it's a hospital or a healthcare center, a community organization, corporation, government, there are all organizational dynamics. They obviously differ depending on the kind of organization, the industry, and things of that sort. So individual learning is always influenced very much by that different context. And I worked with some people here in my department who pioneered work in transformative learning. So I've been very active in the area of how do people transform their mindsets? How do they change their viewpoints? Which in the early days was a much more rare thing. And now with all the complexity and ambiguity in the environment, people are confronted all the time with disorienting dilemmas and disorientation. So they're always having to examine why they think what they thought and whether or not it's going to help them survive and flourish in the current era. So transformative learning seems to be on the rise, along with transformative leadership and transforming organizations, et cetera. So I've done work in that area, and that took me to groups and teams and up to organizations as well. So in addition to the work that I've done with Karen on the DLOQ and the learning culture, I've also worked with a colleague here, Martha Gephardt, and we've sort of explored the notion of different kinds of system dynamics and how they're leveraged. Those that, in addition to culture, might include, practices, management practices, structure, a variety of things, which I know we consider in the DLOQ work also, but this kind of gets, I think, more to micro level, looking at different people who are doing that so that people can see the way in which it gets done with a framework within which to do it. So we adopted a framework that's used by Warner Burke over in the organizational psychology area to look at that, and we adapted it to what it is that we were doing. So I think we both bring common strengths, and we also have complementary differences. And so we make a great pair. We love to work with one another.
So it occurs to me that the things you're mentioning there, such as learning culture, behavior change, I think, to a degree, transformation, are all things which are really kind of hot buzzwords in learning and development on my side of the pond at the moment. But you guys have been working on this stuff for decades. In a way, this is a part 2 podcast, following on from the Reda Sadki podcast, where he referenced your work as being something that's found a touchstone and that has been driving on. Reda is quite laconic. He goes out and he does stuff. And he says, if you want to know about the theoretical side, you have to talk to Karen and Victoria, because it's their stuff that I'm leaning on. Now, there's a couple of things you mentioned. Karen, you mentioned the dimensions of learning, and Reda talked about this is the instrument, I think he was talking about. It is. He used. Can you talk a little bit about what the dimensions of learning is about?
The dimensions of a learning organization are, we developed these we did a multi-year search of the literature on organizational learning and looked at anything we could find on organizations that had a capacity to transform themselves in some fashion, self-designing organizations. So they had many labels back then. And then we also went out and looked at organizations that said they were learning organizations, and we studied them, and we did workshops with a lot of people in corporate settings and government settings, and we would ask them to tell us what would be different if their organization was a learning organization. And out of all of that, we came up with these 7 key notions that things that an organization has to do in order to create a culture that has the capacity to transform itself. And those 7 things are at the individual level, that you have to provide continuous learning for everyone in the organization, not just at the top. You had to encourage dialogue and inquiry so that people with wisdom, regardless of where they sat in the organization, that you could find out what they knew. There was some way to do that. You had to create a spirit of collaboration and team learning, so that people would would feel like they're all part of the same organization, a sort of a collaborative spirit, but also that teams would, that we would convene teams and actually use their recommendations, which I'm sure you know that's a common problem.
Yeah.
And then so that's what am I up to? 3. Then you have to empower people toward a collective vision. Was another dimension that we look at, and that the organization has to make systemic connections with its environment, and it can do that both externally through scanning, and it can do it internally by looking at how the people who work for you also are connected to the environment outside, and then finally, of course, that you have to provide strategic leadership for learning. The role of the leader has to change to be one who facilitates the learning of others. And so we've this is used all over the world. It is, in our work, we also have used these dimensions to compare them with organizational performance dimensions. And so we can tell you that our dimensions are, in fact, correlated with both soft and hard measures of organizational performance, but particularly knowledge performance. So they predict the capacity to be innovative, and to develop new products and services more than, which ultimately I think translates into financial performance. So, so that's the core of the instrument. We developed items that would measure each of those dimensions, and they're very cultural, as you can tell, dialogue and inquiry, those kinds of things. So we think we have a lot of people have used it because it is a pretty strong measure of the culture of the organization around learning.
Interesting. I could ask you a question, Karen, that I asked David Perrin from Fosway, who's an analyst. We've been talking about the learning organization for quite a while in L&D. I asked him if he'd seen any, and he said not an awful lot. Have you seen a lot of organizations that are really doing it well, that are learning organizations?
Yeah, you put that darn word in there, well. Because every organization is a learning organization. By definition, they would be dead if they weren't. They have to learn in order to just sort of stay afloat. But the organizations that we singled out in our first book, we had what we called promising experiments. That there are a lot of things that people do that open up the culture in some way. That give allow information to come in and change to happen. But I think the examples that we liked the best were around 600 people organizations. So think about that in terms of, like a big organization like yours, that's a unit. So there are units that can become fairly transformative. But I haven't seen very many big bureaucracies take this on. And, there is what I did in the Harvard conversation that I had. There was somebody on that call where they're experimenting with a leaderless organization. I don't know whether that will lead to this. Many people are trying a lot of different things. Agile technologies, that people are using, which is I think a promising experiment to try to self-directed work teams kind of thing, so that people can encourage innovation and ultimately, the kind of agility that an organization needs in order to change fast enough to meet environmental press.
You're bringing us up to date now, because a lot of organizations are experimenting with Agile, and it's bringing us towards the stuff that you're working on at the moment, which I'm very interested to hear about. A chapter I've been reading of yours, not yet published, From Work-Based Learning to Learning-Based Work. Could you talk a little about that?
Victoria, why don't you start?
Okay. Yeah. We're working with another co-author on this, Rachel Victor, and she's a learning and development leader in a financial services industry. And I was struck by something I was on sabbatical in the spring, and I asked her to teach my work learning class for a particular cohort of doctoral students. And in part because we've had a lot of conversations around this, and there was a gentleman who wrote about work-based learning a number of years ago, Raylan, wonderful guy, we're still in touch with him. But she was reflecting on the fact that these days, her experiences and what she's reading and talking to people about, that it's really learning-based work, in the sense that work-based learning means you essentially make the learning relevant because you ground it in the work. Because we're all learning, as Karen said, all the time. And that's why I think action research and action learning work, because people are doing things that are meaningful to them. And while they're doing it, they're learning. They don't call it learning, but they're learning along the way. But these days, because of the changes out there, there's also the need to learn new things before you can apply them to work. And so it's both the concept that learning has grown closer. I mean, as we've talked about it, we originally thought that perhaps it was moving learning away from classroom and apart environments more towards the workplace environment itself. And to some extent that's true, but maybe more in a metaphorical sense, because there are times when people have to step away and gain new capabilities. They're not gaining them in the same way as they used to before. It's more of a driven by real work kind of gaining. But for example, Rachel is in charge of leadership development, and the leaders in that financial institution, especially with the approach of artificial intelligence and all the changes that are going on in that era, in that sweep of tsunami that's come upon us of AI, they really do need to step back and learn different things. They have to learn to think differently about things. And they also unlearn some old things and learn new capabilities. And so they have taken them, what they're doing is not that is so innovative. I've heard of things like this before, but it's in that context of really trying to reboot them and also get them engaged then in doing things in different ways in their own environments, because they're putting them in very unusual circumstances. They are going to, to work in, for example, they might be visiting like a service learning kind of environment where you're working and looking at communities where people are impoverished or have different kinds of characteristics than the people they usually sell things to. Or they go to India, or they go to another country, or they take on doing different kinds of things because they have to challenge the mindset that they bring to it. And especially with what we're learning from neuroscience, you can't really change the neural network unless you change the experience. And so they're immersed in different kinds of experiences, and they're processing that in relationship to what that means for what they have to do back on the job. So, I mean, as I said, I think this has always been going on to some extent, but because of the nature and extent of disruption, the choice is either to go with younger generation who already have that new mindset, and cast off the older people, and there's certainly a lot of organizations that are doing that, or value what these people bring for various reasons, and help them to change those mindsets so that they can, in fact, push forward in new ways in the organization. So I think the diagram, it represents several things, and Karen, please add to this, because in some ways we started out by looking at, to what extent was learning mostly separate from work, and how has it moved increasingly towards work, so that we have things, for example, like we were calling it coterminous work, and seamlessly integrated. I know some organizations call it learning in the workflow, or performance adjacent work, performance adjacent learning. So you have those kinds of things, but at the same time, you also have this shift in the new learning that's infused in it. And we also started talking about the fact that as you do that, you're also moving from mostly looking at the learning of individuals to learning of more like systems, teams, networks, organizations, because much work gets done now across boundaries and in networks and in fluid kinds of groups. And so how do people learn to do that? Karen, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was thinking that, when we first played with this a little bit, I asked myself, what is learning-based work now? And frankly, we often call, what we do is the little R&D,
Mhm.
that in research and development, it was always learning-based work. And as a professor, your job is learning-based work.
Mhm.
Many professionals, anytime you have to bring judgment in order to make a judgment call, or solve a problem in order to do the work in the first place, right? Or you have to, you have to develop something, you have to create something new in order to do the work. Anytime you have to do that, I think you are in learning-based work. What struck us in this chapter and why we wanted to talk about it is how ubiquitous that is now, right? So where before that was the special unit over here doing the R&D, now it's more in everybody's job. And so it's that I think makes this somewhat different. And I was talking to Bill Gardner, who's just a wonderful executive coach, and he was talking about an AI program that he uses that monitors when he's in a coaching relationship, and it is in his phone. It's an app. And it'll tell him at the end whether he had been empathetic by tone of voice, right? It'll analyze the coaching interaction simultaneous to his doing it, so that he can sort of test himself and see how he's doing. So it's embedded in the work, but at the same time he's learning and doing in this sort of exponential way, concurrently. It's just really quite fascinating.
Putting a learning management system in place is only half the battle. In some ways, it's the easiest part. Getting your people engaged with the LMS, knowing whether it's actually driving results, that's tough. And with providers locked into their roadmaps, who can you get to help you with custom portals, gamification, out-of-the-box reports, and all those changes you need done yesterday to make your LMS truly yours? Earthly Systems provide expert customization services for LMS. They'll make a rapid response that drives maximum value from your investment, with any functionality they add easily configurable by non-technical staff. And exclusively for listeners to this podcast, Earthly are offering a 25% discount on your first project. Go to earthlysystems.com now and quote the words Learning Hack when you enter your details on the contact page. Earthly helps make the learning land. How's that for a cheesy tagline? Learning in the flow of work has become a very popular buzz phrase in L&D, and a lot of people are working through the problems with this. That in the old days we used to take people away from work in order to give them learning, and then inject them back into the workplace once they'd learned how to do it, and then they would kind of perform, and the two things were separate. And really, we're still in a way in that traditional model in a lot of organizations.
Yes.
So it's a bit confusing for people. So how do we do this? Is this a matter of people are sitting at their desk and they find they can't do something, so we suddenly give them bursts of micro learning content that skill them up? And then aren't you just kind of interrupting the workflow rather than actually embedding it in the workflow and so on? That last example you gave there sounds like something very different where the two things come together. Now, do you see this as a kind of continuum where we start off with the traditional model, left-hand side of the grid, a proper, fully functioning, perhaps AI-supported learning-based work at the end, and it's like a maturity model. People are progressing towards that. And in any given organization, they're in different stages, or is it a kind of is it a thing where you would flex the style you need to use depending on the circumstances? How should people use the structure?
That's a great question.
It is.
Thank you.
I mean, I think it is a continuum. We should both sort of think this out loud, I guess. But I do think it's a continuum, and that it's also it's back to the concurrent notion that all of this is happening all the time. When we do interviews about trying to get people to talk about their informal learning, the first problem you have is they don't think it's learning unless it happened in a classroom. So they have this frame in their mind that they didn't learn. And so then when you inquire and ask them questions, they'll have this big aha, like suddenly they've learned it because you asked them to think about it. So part of what I think it's not just a continuum. It is a maturity. There is a way in which you have to develop a certain skill at reflection and at learning in the moment. What Gardner does is very difficult. I mean, you're working on two planes at the same time. He's interacting with somebody and he's watching himself at this very same moment, and getting this kind of concurrent real time feedback. So I mean that is not for the everyday person, I think. Yeah. So I think you're right about the notion that this is a maturation of learning, both on the individual and the organizational part. But the organization has to think very systemically about learning in all of its manifestations.
I think there are aspects of it that are maturity that are driven by certain kinds of things, So, for example, technology is a big one, right? So, in the beginning, in fact, I find it interesting because when we were reading one of the early articles around schooling and why it was that things were in the classroom around early work-based learning, it had to do with the fact that machines were so expensive and it was risky to put employees on real machines because they might screw up the machine, and then they destroy something that was very valuable. So they had to be learning on something that could be, would be not broken by their making mistakes, etc. And I recently was reading an article, or I actually listening to a TED talk by a gentleman by the name of Bean, who studied medical surgeons and studied how doctors learned how to perform certain surgeries, etc. And he observed that in the past, it was always learning by having somebody show you what to do, and then you try it and you get feedback in the moment. So people who were qualified enough but were learning to get more expertise in these kinds of surgeries would do the surgery themselves, so that they would do 50% of the surgery or 60% or whatever, and the supervising doctor would give that kind of feedback. But with AI and with technology, because the machines are so expensive and the risks are so great, the people who are the more senior people are doing it, and the people who are the more junior people are not getting what they really need, which is experience in doing it, because that's how you really learn to do a lot of things. So I think the technology piece is, but the ubiquity of technology, the fact that it's with us all the time, the fact that both organizations expect employees to be learning this way, and they expect them to be learning all the time. And the people who are younger, who have grown up with this technology, expect to learn that way. They're used to mediated learning all the time. So to some extent, a part of it is being driven by the capacities that technology bring, to the whole thing. But I think there could be other things that are more circular in it, and we kept, I think you recall the conversations, Karen, we said, well, is it really just can you just put it on that a maturity model continuum, or do you have to say that things might be going on at the same time and you might be going back to something at a different point? Another thing that's an interesting part of that is that you pointed out that learning in the workflow may be just interrupting work to learn time, and is it really germane at that point? There have been efforts to really make it more germane, because there are some jobs you can study and what the patterns are. And for example, IBM did a thing many years ago on work apart learning, work embedded learning, and work related learning, I think it was. But so the idea was that some was in the classroom, and that was sort of modular. Some was through periodic needs that you might have, like you're going to go on a sales call with a particular client and you have to get some mentoring. And other of it, you could see that there were patterns across the thing. So you would, in selling, you would know that there are certain things that people would need to bump up against, and you could plan for those things to be available, whether it was by being in touch with an expert, having a video, or whether it was, the right kinds of templates for doing this or that or the other thing. Those things could be put in there. And I think some of it is really an update of that. So when I read some things about learning in the workflow, I think that's what people intend to have happen. But the only challenge around that is that then you will not learn things that are new. It'll be new to you because it's what has to be done for the job, but you're not building your capacity to think differently or to learn differently. And so you kind of are you have to keep learning to do these things new also, or else you sort of wear out and you become useless in some ways
Yeah.
at some point. So, so I think that, there's going to be a need to renew all the time. And that part might not be as predictable as, just going along that straight line to learning-based work.
The more I'm listening to you two, I think that the less I envy your job, really, because something I'm coming to realize through the course of talking to very interesting people in this podcast is that learning is extraordinarily difficult to generalize about.
Right.
Yes.
And you do hear people getting up at conferences and making very sweeping statements about what learning ought to be. And it's kind of agile, fail fast, safe place to fail, blah, blah, blah. And then you talk to somebody who does training for the military and they say, well, we've got this helicopter that costs a squillion quid. And we're not going to let anybody get into it until they're actually trained to fly it. Mm-hmm. So we're waiting for the simulator to turn up. So you have to do that first. And you realize that, this use case just seems to blow a lot of the theoretical side out of the water. Is that a problem for you guys? That as soon as you come up with something, oh, this looks like an interesting model of learning, real examples just don't kind of fit into that, and it is difficult to come up with a framework for what we're talking about, because really perhaps we're talking about a lot of different things.
When we did the informal and incidental learning model, we drew a circle around it called context, and didn't think about that very much. And then we had doctoral students go out and use the model in their research, and they would come back and context was like,
Right.
It wasn't big enough in the model. It was clearly every time you'd go out, I had this student that went out into Romania right at the turn when they went from a centralized economy to an entrepreneurial one. And so, I mean, the context drove everything. It was just so pervasive. And, we had many examples since then. But yeah, I think that it's not so much that the theory about how the learning happens, it gets richer for sure with each iteration, but context is just, it's an incredibly important part. But, and of course, our most recent book, we did look at how we think, new learning theory also has to be taken into account. Just not just the emergence of technology, but what Victoria was saying earlier about the you just don't work solo much anymore. You might work at home, but even then you're not working solo because it's so much of work is social and collaborative. So the nature of learning has a very strong social component to it, and it's not just individual cognition. I don't know what I know often until I hear how somebody else reacts to it. So even what I think I've derived completely autonomously, it gets validated in some social context. So we have revisited our model from that standpoint, and others have, certainly critiqued it or added to it in some way, because there is this complexity that can't be accounted for by a single way of talking about learning.
So has work become more social, do you think?
Oh,
I think so. I think learning has become more social. Work has too. There are, of course, always jobs that are, more or require more solitary work, right? And more solitary learning. I mean, whenever I've talked to people about this, they say, well, there still are things that people go off and learn on their own because they're just fascinated with it, and they're not going to stop learning it because that drives them, right? So I think there are individual learning projects, but in the workplace, in the corporate workplace, in many organizational workplace, I might accept higher ed, because higher ed, we have some things we do collaboratively, but there's a lot that's still done through individual expertise and development of that. That's the only way work can be done, because we have to have all these differences coming together. Problems and challenges are often greater than we've had before. We don't know what the solutions are, and we need to and also I think because organizations used to be more siloed, And now they're
Yeah.
more networked and flatter. So we have to account for people across like the value chain or across different functions. And so you're getting all those different views out there. And by doing that, it requires both the social aspect, learning from others, seeing what they do, learning from their perspectives. And it also requires greater skills in collaboration, which is why Agile might be such a great technology if it's used right and for the right circumstances, because it has these different structural mechanisms that help to keep that moving along, from what I can see of it.
So I had a question I was going to ask about who you follow in the world of learning gurudom, or who do you rate? But I think it's also worth saying, do things like 70-20-10 mean anything to you? Reda was being very dismissive about whole swathes of this type of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I'm of the view, and I think, Karen, you are too, that, that because things are moving so quickly right now, that I don't know if it's only the gurus, but I think that that practice needs to lead theory building as much as theory needs to lead practice, because the things that people are confronting on the margins in organizations today are so different. They're same, I'm sure, in some ways, but there are many different kinds of challenges. And so I think that I think we have students who work in the world of practice, and I think by interacting, our first book was really we depended a lot also on talking with our students because they were out there doing these things. So I think it's a combination of going back and forth. So I try to keep up with who's out there and who people are talking about. Sometimes I find that the ideas that they're talking about are not that different from other ideas, but they have new names. And sometimes I think they're new ideas, So I think in the roles that we play, we have to be current enough with what people are saying and the language they're using just to be able to make ourselves clear. But we sometimes think that some of the stuff we thought about was thought about way ahead of what some of the stuff people are thinking about now with some new names,
I know.
It's inevitable.
Yeah.
I don't know. When I thought about the idea of a learning guru is kind of funny in some respects because, of course, we do scholarship, so we're academics. So, guru is a little, it's a hard title to give to somebody. I do like Jane Hart's work on your side of the pond very much on modern workplace learning.
Yes, she's very well respected and thought of as being
very, very good work.
Very hard-headed and practical.
Yes, she is. And George Siemens' notions of the 7 affordances of learning, I think for somebody trying to understand technology and its impact on learning, I think makes a lot of sense. But I love what Reda does, honestly. Reda's notion, he takes our theory and he puts it into practice in a way that is at such a high level. I mean, he clearly, if you looked at our work, you'd have to say that, and by the way, Reda says this about his work, that he designs learning in a way that embraces all of its, informal and formal natures, but with an aim to change something, not just change people, but to change a system. And so he wants to change all of immunization practice, really, in the globe. I mean, he has large ambitions, but that coupling of learning with change is at the heart of everything that we've ever done. I mean, our work on the Learning Organization was to try to communicate that you can't change something without somebody learning. Right? You can't just go out and say, I'm going to be a learning organization. You have to change your way there. You can't say, I'm going to make a change in this organization without teaching people to do it. And so the coupling of learning and change, and particularly change that is more than, an individual, but perhaps at the whole culture level, he takes that work and puts it into practice and does it at scale. With 400 people at a time. So I've learned a lot just by watching what he's done, taking our ideas and then trying to apply them to a context that is, quite fascinating.
And with the Impact Accelerator program in particular, what would you say is distinctively different about that? Obviously, he's drawing on your ideas, so.
Well, he got it because we were having a conversation. He had hired me to come in and evaluate the first work they had done, which was kind of a standard, still large scale, but it was e-learning in a and so he'd begun to experiment with a little bit of this whole notion of the informal learning. He had brought in the Harvard random coffee conversations that people did virtually, and he brought in some WhatsApp groups to sort of, people would follow on and talk. And so there would be all these informal learning add-ons that he'd come up with. And then, but when I talked to him about doing the survey, I said that, well, you've got embedded in the Scholar platform. You've assessed their learning. You've assessed all of their reactions to everything. I'm interested in impact. And how do we measure that? And so for me, that was, were they using anything that they had learned? And so he got into that whole notion that he had to have an impact. And then being Reda, he had to escalate that to, well, God, now how do we accelerate ensuring that people use it? So and then he talked to the guy at Zapnito, and that rest is history. So he got the thing going, but and then he himself had because he comes out of that nonprofit world, he built this whole volunteer army of accompanists that were these people that 250 people sign on to volunteered to go in and help the new learners in the new courses as he adds each course. He gets this alumni group moving along. So he's built a network that exists as a you teach a course and the students go away at the end of the course. Well, in his world, they never go away. They just keep getting added to this database of alumni that become part of the teaching and learning process. So to me, that whole now he's thinking about learning in this very systemic way at a global level about how do we change and transform, immunization. So
does that apply to the wider organizational context? Could you see that working elsewhere? I mean,
I can. I've got a student right now at KPMG that is they've built an 800-bed facility. Training function in Orlando that's just this amazing facility for fairly traditional learning, but they have heard of informal learning. So now they think they ought to have so they have tried to design the space with places people can convene and gather. But so what I'm working with him on is how can we now create something like the Impact Accelerator so that we could do we're calling it Beyond the Classroom Learning. And so we're trying to build in a very traditional accountant organization, something that would be similar to the Impact Accelerator.
Earlier, you mentioned the fact that occasionally you do come across ideas that really are genuinely new, as opposed to old stuff with a new coat of paint on it and a new name. Mm-hmm. Could each of you, do you think, or both of you, maybe the same one, give me an example of one new idea that you've come across that you think is really exciting at the moment?
So much of what I learned through my students, but I have this incredible student. She's a CEO of an insurance company who's using our work and looking at advanced notions of complex adaptive systems theory, and really trying to understand how the sort of the learning dimension of navigating your way through a complex adaptive system. And so concepts like emergence, she's into fractal geometry at this point. I'm just along for the ride, but but the work around that she's found that's so intriguing is Holland, who does a different look at, complex adaptive systems theory as I've read it. I was looking at the social and behavioral sciences. And so she's gone back more to physics and the sciences. And so looking at complex adaptive systems in a really new way and trying to understand what that might mean for learning in organizations is fascinating to me, actually.
One of the ideas that I've come across that I think is really important, because I think what's shifted is what people want to learn and how they want to learn. So in the past, people wanted to get good information and facts, and now they really want to be involved in experiences, and they want to be passionately engaged in them in one way or another. And you can juxtapose that, however, with things like, the online learning. So I'm still trying to reconcile how you put these things together. But I have come across some work out of Finland on trialogic learning. So the notion is that, much of the learning that we work with when we're face-to-face is at best dialogic. It's interpersonal, it's dialogic, it's a couple of people. But trialogic means there's another player in the mix. And this is where we have a lot of the mediated learning. And they follow work by people like Safard and Engstrom. And Engstrom has done I've always been interested in his work. He comes along with Vygotsky's work in activity theory, but he has a social change lab. He's half the time in Finland and half the time in, I think, or recently anyway, University of San Diego in California. And he brings organizations together in labs where they really look through the lens of activity theory at particular situations where they're trying to achieve certain objectives, and looks at what's happening, and then they analyze that with certain kinds of tools, et cetera. So the combination of that and the combination of the online learning in the new space, such as the space that George Siemens talks about in connectivism, is giving rise to this notion of a new way of thinking about learning that's trialogic and not either monologic, me, myself, and I thinking together, or dialogic, a few people thinking in a smaller group. And I think that's something that's lifting the level of conversation. The other thing I just wanted to say is I think that we're making a big assumption as we move into this era that people know how to learn. And there's a lot that's being looked at in relationship to the capacity to learn and capacity to learn in this way, because as Karen said, for example, you have to reflect, and there are people who can't reflect. So how do you build a capacity, and how do you estimate where people are in order to be able to support that kind of learning appropriately, is another, I think, big frontier that is opening up in different ways.
I think I'm going to be reflecting for about a month after this. You've given me so many ideas to think about. Karen, Victoria, thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast. Thanks to our guests, Karen E Watkins and Victoria Marsick, to our sponsors, Earthly Systems and Powtoon, and to our listeners in 33 countries around the world. The Learning Hack is completely independent, transparently funded by sponsorship. So if you're keen to see it continue in the future, please make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to help other people find us, please give a 5-star rating on iTunes. You can reach me at John Helmer on Twitter or through my website, johnhelmerconsulting.com. Coming up on the Learning Hack, get ready for a bumper Christmas annual, a review of 2019 in learning with the brilliant Miles Runham and the woman who last year topped the list of learning's #1 movers and shakers, Laura Overton. Goodbye until then.
Now I finally get it.